There are things that should stay buried, not because they're dead, but because they're waiting. In March of 2024, an archaeological team from Cambridge University began excavations at a site near the village of Rothwell, England. The ground-penetrating radar had detected something unusual beneath what appeared to be a medieval execution ground. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead archaeologist, expected to find mass graves, perhaps evidence of plague burials or religious persecution. She had no idea they were about to release something that had been imprisoned for 700 years. The dig started normally enough. Standard excavation protocols, careful grid mapping, meticulous documentation. The team consisted of 8 people: Dr. Mitchell, 5 graduate students, and 2 local laborers. Professional, experienced, prepared for historical discoveries. They were not prepared for Malleus. The first anomaly appeared on day 3. Graduate student James Chen was excavating a layer of compacted clay when his trowel struck something hard, not bone, not stone, something that felt wrong against the metal, like scraping glass with fingernails. The sound it made caused everyone within earshot to wince involuntarily. They carefully exposed the object over the next 6 hours. It was a box, roughly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep, made of a black metal none of them could identify. No rust, no corrosion, no sign of age despite being buried for centuries. The surface was covered in inscriptions, not Latin or any language Dr. Mitchell recognized. The symbols seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, shifting and rearranging like living things. "We should call this in," said graduate student Emma Rodriguez. "Get specialists. This isn't normal archaeological protocol." But Dr. Mitchell was already fascinated. Her career had been respectable, but unremarkable. 30 years of digs that produced academic papers read by dozens. This could be different. This could be significant, revolutionary even. "We'll document everything thoroughly," she said. "Then we'll open it, carefully, with all proper precautions." The box had no visible lock, no hinges, no seams, except for one thin line running around its perimeter. Dr. Mitchell tried to pry it open gently. Nothing. Applied more pressure. Still nothing. The box seemed to be sealed by something beyond mechanical means. Then James touched one of the symbols, tracing its shape with his finger. The box grew warm. The inscriptions began to glow with a sick greenish light, and with a sound like a sigh, like something exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. The box opened. Inside was nothing, just darkness. Not the darkness of an empty space, but darkness as a substance, as a presence. It didn't reflect light. It absorbed it, drank it, pulled it in like a black hole. And from that darkness came a smell like copper and old guilt and things better left forgotten. "Close it," Emma said, her voice high with sudden fear. "Close it right now." But it was too late. Something had already left the box. Not physically. Nothing emerged that they could see. But everyone in that excavation pit felt it simultaneously. A presence. An awareness. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien sliding into the space around them, tasting the air, sampling their minds like a connoisseur testing wine. Dr. Mitchell slammed the box shut. The darkness was gone. The smell faded. But the presence remained. They could all feel it, a weight in the air, a pressure behind their eyes, a voice that wasn't quite a voice whispering at the edges of their consciousness. "Did anyone else feel that?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her voice shaking. They all had. They all still did. James Chen was the first to change. It started that night, back at the hotel where the team was staying. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces, strangers, people he'd never met but somehow knew intimately. And with each face came knowledge. Complete, detailed knowledge of their worst moments, their deepest shames, the things they'd done that they could never take back. He saw a woman who'd abandoned her mentally ill brother to homelessness because caring for him was inconvenient. Saw her justify it, rationalize it, eventually forget about it while her brother died alone under a bridge. He saw a man who'd witnessed his co-worker being sexually harassed by their boss and said nothing, did nothing because he didn't want to risk his own promotion. Watched the co-worker spiral into depression and eventually suicide while the man climbed the corporate ladder. He saw a teenager who'd started a rumor that destroyed a classmate's reputation and life, done casually, thoughtlessly, never considering the consequences. The classmate had moved away, broken and isolated, carrying that damage forever. Face after face, sin after sin. Not dramatic evils, not murder or violence, but the casual cruelties, the convenient cowardices, the small betrayals that humans commit and rationalize and forget. Thousands of them, millions. An endless parade of moral failures, each one documented in perfect, excruciating detail. And James realized with growing horror that he knew these weren't random visions. These were real people, real events. And something was showing them to him deliberately, forcing him to witness, to judge, to know. By morning, James was catatonic. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at nothing, tears streaming down his face, mumbling apologies to people who weren't there. Emma found him and called Dr. Mitchell immediately. James, can you hear me?" Dr. Mitchell knelt in front of him. His eyes focused on her briefly, and what she saw in them made her blood run cold. Not madness, not confusion. Recognition. Terrible, complete recognition. "I see them," James whispered. "All of them. Every person who ever made a choice they knew was wrong, but made it anyway. Every moment of moral cowardice, every convenient betrayal. It's showing me, making me watch, making me know." "What is? What's showing you?" "The thing from the box. Malleus, that's its name. Not a name we gave it. Its name. What it is. The hammer. The judge. The thing that makes you see." Dr. Mitchell felt something cold slide down her spine. "James, you need rest. Medical attention. I'm calling—" "It's in all of us now," James interrupted, his voice flat and mechanical. "It opened and it entered and it's growing, feeding on what it finds. And there's so much to feed on, Doctor. So much guilt. So much shame. So many things we've done and buried and pretended didn't matter. But they did matter. They all mattered. And Malleus remembers. James was hospitalized that afternoon. The doctors found nothing physically wrong. His brain scans were normal, blood work perfect, but he couldn't stop seeing the visions, couldn't stop cataloging human moral failures, couldn't stop weeping for sins that weren't his own. The hospital psychiatrist diagnosed him with acute psychotic episode, possibly triggered by stress or an undiagnosed condition. Prescribed antipsychotics, they made no difference. You can't medicate away something that isn't a chemical imbalance. You can't drug yourself free of a parasite that lives in your conscience. Back at the dig site, the team tried to continue working. They'd resealed the box, documented everything, sent photos and data to Cambridge. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone felt watched, judged. The weight of unseen eyes constantly evaluating, measuring, finding them wanting. Emma Rodriguez started experiencing symptoms on day 2 after the opening. Not visions like James, but something worse. She began remembering things she'd done, not forgetting them, she'd never truly forgotten, but remembering them with perfect clarity and an inability to rationalize them away. She was 12 when she'd watched a group of classmates bully a girl with a facial deformity. Watched them mock her, imitate her speech impediment, throw her lunch on the floor. Emma hadn't participated, but she hadn't stopped it either, had stood there, safe in her silence. Relieved, it wasn't her being targeted. The girl's name was Sophie Chen. She'd transferred schools 3 months later. Emma had never thought about her again, until now. Now, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. Couldn't stop seeing her face. Couldn't stop feeling the weight of that moment when she'd chosen her own social safety over another person's dignity. It had been 20 years ago. It shouldn't matter anymore. She'd been a child. She hadn't known better. But Malleus was showing her that she had known better. that 12-year-old Emma had understood perfectly well that what was happening was wrong, had felt the impulse to speak up, to intervene, to help, and had chosen not to, had made a conscious decision that her comfort mattered more than Sophie's suffering. That was the thing about Malleus. It didn't show you things you didn't know. It stripped away the rationalizations, the justifications, the comfortable lies you told yourself about your own actions. It made you see your choices as they actually were, not as you'd rewritten them in memory. Emma tried to apologize. She tracked down Sophie Chen through social media, sent a message explaining, saying she was sorry, that she should have done something, that she regretted her cowardice. Sophie never responded. Maybe she didn't remember. Maybe she'd moved past it. Or maybe she simply had no interest in accepting an apology that came 20 years too late, and only because the apologizer could no longer live with her own guilt. That was when Emma understood. Malleus didn't want confession or redemption. It wanted you to know. To truly, completely know what you'd done and what it had meant and what it had cost someone else. And then it wanted you to carry that knowledge forever, without the ability to minimize it or forget it or move on. Dr. Mitchell tried to shut down the dig, called Cambridge, explained that there had been incidents, that the team needed psychiatric support, that something was wrong. But the university was more interested in the mysterious box than in the team's mental health. They wanted it transported to Cambridge immediately for analysis. They wanted papers written, press releases. This could be the find of the century. Dr. Mitchell refused to touch the box again. Let someone else take that responsibility. Let someone else unleash whatever was inside on themselves. But she already knew it was too late. The box had been opened. Malleus had been freed. And it wasn't confined to the box anymore. To understand Malleus, you must first understand what it was created to be. Not by nature, but by purpose. By deliberate, terrible design. In the year 1327, in a monastery in northern England, a group of monks made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had discovered something during their theological studies, a ritual buried in texts the church had deemed too dangerous to preserve, a ritual for creating a spiritual weapon, a tool for enforcing moral purity through psychological torture. The monks called it the Malleus Conscientiae, the hammer of conscience, an entity that would parasitize human minds, specifically targeting the moral center, the part of the brain that feels guilt and shame. It would amplify those feelings to unbearable levels, force people to confront every wrong they'd ever committed. Strip away the psychological defenses that let humans live with their own imperfections. The ritual required sacrifices, not of life, but of something more valuable, conscience itself. Each monk who participated had to willingly surrender their own moral sense, their ability to feel guilt or shame or moral conflict. They had to make themselves psychopathic, cutting away the very part of themselves that made them human. 7 monks participated. 7 men who believed so completely in the righteousness of their cause that they destroyed their own souls to create a weapon against sin. The ritual worked. Malleus came into being born from their sacrificed conscience, a creature made entirely of moral judgment, without mercy or understanding. It was everything they'd wanted, a perfect enforcer of righteousness, a thing that would make sinners suffer in proportion to their sins. But the monks had made a terrible miscalculation. They'd assumed they were creating a tool they could control, a weapon they could aim. What they actually created was a parasite that couldn't distinguish between degrees of sin, between genuine evil and human imperfection, between malicious cruelty and simple weakness. Malleus infected the monastery within days. Monks began experiencing visions, overwhelming guilt, psychological torture over every minor transgression. A monk who'd been slightly envious of a brother's Latin skills suffered the same as one who'd stolen from the poor box. The parasite couldn't judge context or intent. It only measured deviation from perfect moral purity. And humans, by definition, could never achieve perfect moral purity. Within 3 weeks, 4 monks had committed suicide. 2 more had gone violently insane, attacking others in attempts to cleanse them. The seventh had fallen into catatonia, trapped in an endless loop of self-judgment and moral horror. The abbot, who hadn't participated in the ritual and thus retained his sanity, made a desperate decision. He couldn't destroy Malleus. The entity was spiritual, not physical, but he could contain it, trap it, bury it. He commissioned the construction of the black metal box, hired a scholar of Jewish mysticism, a man who knew binding rituals the church didn't acknowledge. Together they created a prison inscribed with symbols of containment from a dozen different traditions. Christian, Jewish, Islamic, pagan, whatever might work. They lured Malleus into the box with a sacrifice. A condemned prisoner, a murderer scheduled for execution, was brought to the monastery and placed before the open box. Malleus, drawn to the man's guilt like a shark to blood, entered the box to feed. The moment it did, the abbot slammed it shut, and the scholar activated the seals. The box was buried in the execution ground, covered in consecrated clay, warded with prayers in 7 languages, and there it remained for nearly 700 years, waiting, patient, hungry, until Dr. Sarah Mitchell's team dug it up and opened it. The parallels between Malleus and its creators were obvious and damning. The monks had tried to enforce moral perfection while committing the ultimate immorality, destroying their own humanity. They'd created a thing that judged others while being incapable of self-judgment. Malleus was born from conscience destroyed. It fed on conscience intact. It was simultaneously the tool of moral enforcement and the proof that moral enforcement through psychological torture was itself immoral. The monks had wanted to punish sinners. Instead, they'd created something that couldn't distinguish between a saint with one minor flaw and a monster with one redeeming quality. Malleus saw all imperfection as equal, all humans as equally guilty, because all humans, without exception, had at some point in their lives chosen their own comfort over another's suffering, had made the convenient decision, had looked away at the crucial moment. That was Malleus's terrible truth. It didn't hunt monsters. It didn't target the genuinely evil. It fed on normal humans because normal humans were its natural prey. Every person carries guilt. Every conscience holds buried moments of moral failure. And Malleus could find them all. Back at the hotel, the remaining team members were falling apart. Graduate student Marcus Webb began cutting himself, trying to create physical pain intense enough to drown out the psychological torture of remembering every casual cruelty he'd ever committed, every time he'd laughed at someone else's expense, every moment he'd chosen to be silent when he should have spoken up. Local laborer. Tom Harrigan drank himself into unconsciousness every night, but the alcohol made it worse. It lowered his inhibitions, stripped away his psychological defenses, left his conscience naked and vulnerable to Malleus's probing. He'd wake up screaming, begging forgiveness from people he'd wronged decades ago, people he'd forgotten until the parasite reminded him. Dr. Mitchell was the last holdout. She prided herself on being a good person, ethical, moral.
She'd lived carefully, trying to do the right thing, trying not to hurt people. Surely she'd be immune. Surely her conscience was clean enough that Malleus would find nothing to feed on. She was wrong. It came for her on night 7. She was reviewing her field notes, trying to focus on work, when the memories started flooding back. Not dramatic sins, not terrible crimes, just the small, everyday moral failures that everyone commits and immediately forgets.
She saw herself at age 16, watching her mother struggle with depression, finding excuses not to spend time with her because it was uncomfortable and awkward, and teenage Sarah had better things to do. Saw her mother's face, the hurt she tried to hide, the loneliness that Sarah could have eased, but chose not to. She saw herself at 30, getting a colleague fired by making a casual comment to their supervisor about the colleague's attitude problems. The colleague had been going through a divorce, struggling, difficult to work with. Sarah hadn't meant to get her fired, had just been venting. But she'd known what she was doing, had known her words would have consequences, had said them anyway because it made her life easier. She saw herself last year, walking past a homeless man asking for help, pretending not to hear him because she was running late and didn't want to be bothered. The man had been elderly, clearly unwell. She'd had cash in her wallet. It would have taken 30 seconds. She'd kept walking. Each memory was razor sharp, stripped of all the comfortable context she'd wrapped around it. No excuses, no rationalizations. Just the bare fact of her choices and what they'd meant to the people affected by them. Dr. Mitchell had always thought of herself as a good person. She'd been wrong. She was just a person. Flawed, selfish in small ways, capable of cruelty through indifference. Human. And Malleus was making her see every single moment where her humanity had failed. She tried to run. Packed her bags at 3 a.m., drove away from Rothwell, put miles between herself and the dig site. It made no difference. Malleus wasn't tied to a location. It was inside her now, a parasite wrapped around her conscience, feeding on her guilt, growing stronger with every memory it forced her to confront. By dawn, she'd pulled over on the side of the road, sobbing too hard to drive safely. She called her mother, something she hadn't done in 3 months, and tried to apologize for 16-year-old Sarah's neglect. Her mother was confused, said it was fine, that Sarah had been a good daughter, that teenagers were supposed to be self-absorbed. But Malleus wouldn't let Dr. Mitchell accept the forgiveness. It showed her the truth beneath her mother's kind words, showed her the nights her mother had cried alone, wishing her daughter would just talk to her, just spend time with her, just care. Showed her the damage that had never healed, just been buried under years, and politeness, and maternal love. Dr. Mitchell understood then what Malleus truly was. Not a demon, not an evil entity seeking to corrupt. It was something far more terrifying. It was the truth, unfiltered, unmerciful. The complete, accurate picture of who you actually were beneath all the stories you told yourself. And most humans couldn't survive that truth. The team's psychiatrist, Dr. Helena Cross, was brought in on day 8. Cambridge had finally acknowledged that something was seriously wrong. 4 team members hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. 2 missing, including Dr. Mitchell. The remaining 2 refusing to leave their hotel rooms. Dr. Cross interviewed each patient, listened to their descriptions of the visions, the memories, the overwhelming guilt. She was professional, thorough, non-judgmental. She diagnosed collective delusion, possibly triggered by discovering something in the box that released hallucinogenic compounds. Rare, but documented. There were fungi that could cause such symptoms. Environmental toxins, ergot poisoning, perfectly rational explanations. Then she visited the dig site to investigate the box herself. She opened it, despite being warned, despite the team's pleading. She was a scientist. She needed to examine the evidence directly. The box was empty, just darkness, just like the report said. She took samples of the residue on the box's interior, sealed it back up, made careful notes. That night, Malleus came for her. Dr. Cross had spent her career studying the human mind. She understood psychological defense mechanisms, cognitive biases, the ways humans rationalize their behavior. She'd thought that knowledge would protect her, that understanding the mechanism would render it powerless. She was wrong. Malleus showed her everything. Every patient she'd diagnosed incorrectly because she'd been tired and hadn't read the file thoroughly. Every time she'd prescribed medication without fully listening to the patient's concerns. Every moment she'd prioritized her own convenience over someone's mental health. She saw the patient who'd committed suicide 3 months after she'd dismissed his complaints as attention-seeking. She'd been right that he had borderline personality disorder. She'd been wrong that it made his suffering less real, less urgent, less deserving of immediate intervention. She saw the teenager she'd recommended for inpatient commitment, separating her from her family for 6 months because it was easier than providing intensive outpatient support. The girl had been traumatized by the hospitalization, developed PTSD from being physically restrained during a panic attack. Dr. Cross had never followed up, had never known the damage her convenient decision had caused. Face after face, patient after patient, a career's worth of small failures, casual negligences, moments where she'd let her own burnout and exhaustion take priority over another human's well-being. Dr. Cross lasted 3 days before attempting suicide. They found her in her hotel room, pills scattered across the floor, a note that read only, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have known." She survived. But like the others, she was broken, trapped in an endless cycle of moral self-examination, unable to accept forgiveness, unable to move past her failures, unable to escape the parasite feeding on her conscience. By week 3, the number of infected had grown exponentially. Not just the archaeological team, but people they'd had contact with. Hotel staff, local villagers, first responders who'd treated the victims. Malleus was spreading. The infection vector was psychological, not physical. You didn't catch it through blood or air. You caught it through proximity to the infected, through exposure to their guilt. Being near someone being tortured by Malleus created a kind of resonance. It made you think about your own failings, made you vulnerable, made you available for infection. Cambridge quarantined the entire village of Rothwell, called it a contamination event, chemical leak from the excavation. They cordoned off the area, prevented anyone from leaving, brought in psychiatric teams to treat what they officially called mass hysteria. But the psychiatric teams became infected too, and their families, and the military personnel maintaining the quarantine. Malleus was growing, feeding, spreading like a wildfire through the moral vulnerabilities of everyone it touched. Father Thomas Shaw, a local priest, tried to perform exorcisms. He'd read about Malleus's origins in medieval texts, understood it was a spiritual entity, thought perhaps prayer and faith could banish it. He was wrong. Malleus was created from destroyed conscience. It existed in the space where morality should be. Exorcism requires moral authority, spiritual righteousness. But anyone righteous enough to perform an exorcism would, by definition, have a conscience. And having a conscience meant being vulnerable to Malleus. Father Shaw lasted 30 minutes in Dr. Mitchell's hospital room before the visions started. Every sermon he'd cut short because he was tired. Every parishioner he'd avoided because their problems were too messy, too complex, too time-consuming. Every moment he'd chosen his own comfort over his pastoral duties. He ran from the hospital sobbing, his faith shattered. Not because he'd lost belief in God, but because he'd lost belief in his own righteousness. Malleus had shown him the truth. He was just a man, flawed, selfish in small ways, human, and humans make terrible priests. The British government considered drastic measures, bombing the site, attempting to physically destroy the box, but experts warned that Malleus wasn't tied to the box anymore. It had been freed. Destroying the prison wouldn't imprison the entity again. They considered killing the infected. If Malleus fed on human conscience, removing the hosts might starve it. But the infected now numbered in the hundreds, thousands, possibly. The quarantine was failing. People were escaping, carrying Malleus with them, spreading it to new populations. And besides, killing people for being infected with guilt seemed like exactly the kind of moral failure that would invite Malleus in the first place. That's when Dr. Yuki Tanaka proposed the radical solution. A neuroscientist specializing in moral cognition, she understood what others didn't. You couldn't fight Malleus with righteousness. That was its food source. You couldn't defeat it with moral perfection. That was impossible for humans to achieve. You had to fight it with acceptance. Malleus feeds on the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are, Dr. Tanaka explained to the emergency response team. It amplifies guilt by forcing us to confront our failures without the psychological defenses that normally let us function. But what if we could create a population that doesn't need those defenses? People who've already accepted their imperfections, who've done the moral inventory and made peace with it. That's impossible, someone objected. You're describing saints, enlightened beings. We don't have time to create thousands of perfect people. Not perfect people, Dr. Tanaka corrected. Honest people. There's a difference. Perfection is unattainable. Honesty is just difficult. She proposed a program of intensive therapy for the infected. Not to cure them, that was impossible once Malleus had taken hold, but to teach them to accept what the parasite was showing them, to acknowledge their failures without being destroyed by them, to say, yes, I did that. It was wrong. I can't change it. I can only try to do better now. It was radical, unproven, possibly insane, but they had no other options. The first test subject was Dr. Mitchell herself. She'd been catatonic for 2 weeks, trapped in an endless loop of self-recrimination. Dr. Tanaka sat with her for hours, not trying to convince her she was blameless, but helping her see that blame and worth weren't the same thing. You failed your mother sometimes, Dr. Tanaka said gently. That's true. You were a self-absorbed teenager. That's also true. And your mother was hurt by it. Also true. But you were 16. You didn't have the emotional capacity to be what she needed. You were surviving adolescence the best you could. That's not an excuse. But it is context. Context doesn't matter, Dr. Mitchell whispered. I hurt her. I chose myself over her. That's what I did. Yes, and she still loves you. She still forgave you, even though you didn't ask for forgiveness at the time. Even though you didn't know you needed it. She forgave you anyway. Can you forgive yourself? I don't deserve forgiveness. No one deserves forgiveness. That's not how it works. Forgiveness isn't earned, it's given. By others and by yourself. Malleus is showing you your failures, but it's not showing you the whole picture. It's not showing you every time you succeeded, every time you chose kindness over convenience, every patient you helped, every colleague you supported, every small good deed you've done and forgotten. Because those don't matter. The failures matter. They both matter. That's the point. You're not just your worst moments. You're also not just your best moments. You're the whole complicated mess. And the whole complicated mess is enough. It has to be, because it's all any of us have. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of intensive therapy, of guided acceptance, of learning to hold both guilt and self-worth simultaneously. But slowly, Dr. Mitchell began to change. The memories didn't go away. Malleus didn't release her. But she stopped fighting it, stopped trying to rationalize or justify or escape. Just accepted it. Yes, I did those things. They were wrong. I wish I'd done better. I'll try to do better now. That's all I can do. And when she accepted it, truly accepted it without reservation or defense, Malleus began to weaken its grip. Not because it was defeated, but because it had nothing left to feed on. Guilt requires denial to exist. Shame requires the gap between your ideal self and your actual self. When you close that gap through acceptance, the parasite starves. Dr. Mitchell was the first success. Over the next 6 months, Dr. Tanaka's team worked with hundreds of infected individuals, teaching them the same process: radical acceptance, honest self-assessment, the willingness to hold guilt without being destroyed by it. It didn't work for everyone. Some people couldn't accept what they'd done. Their self-image was too fragile, their psychological defenses too necessary for survival. They remained trapped, tormented by Malleus forever. But for many it worked. They emerged changed, not healed exactly. The memories remained sharp. The guilt didn't fully disappear. But they learned to carry it without being crushed. Learned to function despite knowing, truly knowing, every failure and flaw. They became, in a strange way, more moral, because they couldn't hide from themselves anymore, couldn't make convenient choices and forget about them. Malleus had stripped away that ability, So they made better choices now, because they knew with perfect clarity what their choices cost. The box was never reopened. It remained in a secure facility at Cambridge, warded and sealed, a reminder of what happens when humans try to weaponize morality. The inscriptions on its surface still moved and shifted, still whispered promises of judgment and punishment. But Malleus itself was still out there, in the hundreds of people it had infected, in the expanding circle of awareness it had created. It couldn't be killed or banished or imprisoned again. It had become part of human consciousness now, a permanent addition to the psychological landscape. Some people viewed this as a disaster, a plague of guilt that had infected thousands and would continue spreading. They weren't entirely wrong, but others, particularly those who'd survived the infection and learned to live with it, saw it differently. Malleus had forced them to see the truth about themselves, had stripped away the comfortable lies and forced confessions, had made them genuinely confront the cost of their choices. And in doing so, it had made them better. Not perfect, never perfect, but more aware, more careful, more consciously choosing to minimize harm. They couldn't forget their failures anymore, so they worked harder not to create new ones. Dr. Mitchell returned to archaeology 2 years later. She worked differently now, more carefully, with more consideration for the cultures she studied, the sites she disturbed, the artifacts she claimed for academic research. She'd learned that even scholarly work carried moral weight, that every choice had consequences someone would bear. She never forgot the faces Malleus had shown her, her mother, her colleagues, the people she'd hurt through neglect or convenience or simple selfishness. They were always there, a permanent addition to her consciousness, but she'd learned to carry them without drowning. That was Malleus's true nature, not a punishment or a curse, but a mirror, an entity that showed you exactly who you were, stripped of all pretense and self-deception, and then forced you to decide what you'd do with that knowledge. Most people spent their lives avoiding that mirror, building psychological defenses, creating comfortable narratives, burying their failures under layers of rationalization. Malleus ripped all that away, forced you to look, made you see, and once you'd seen, once you truly knew yourself in all your flawed, complicated, imperfect humanity, you had only two choices. You could be destroyed by that knowledge, or you could accept it and grow. The archaeologists who opened the box had hoped to find historical treasure. Instead, they'd found something more valuable and more terrible. They'd found a truth humans have spent millennia trying to avoid. We are all guilty, every one of us, of small cruelties and convenient cowardices and casual betrayals. We are all imperfect moral beings stumbling through life, hurting people, failing our own standards, falling short of who we wish we were. Malleus was the hammer that broke the comfortable illusions, the parasite that fed on denial, the mirror that couldn't lie. And it was still growing, still spreading, still waiting in the conscience of everyone it touched, ready to show them the truth about themselves the moment they became vulnerable enough to see it. The question wasn't whether you'd encounter Malleus. Given enough time, enough proximity to the infected, enough moments of moral reflection, it would find you eventually. The question was what you'd do when it did, when it showed you every failure, every cruelty, every moment you chose wrong, when it stripped away every excuse and left you naked before your own conscience. Would you break? Would you run? Would you rationalize and deny and fight? Or would you look in the mirror and say, yes, that's me. That's what I did. I can't change it. I can only try to do better now. That was the only way to survive Malleus. Not by defeating it, but by accepting what it showed you. Not by proving you were good, but by acknowledging you were human. And humanity, with all its flaws and failures and compromises and cruelties, was enough. It had to be, because it was all we had. The box remained sealed at Cambridge, but Malleus walked free, in the minds of the infected, in the spreading awareness of moral responsibility. in the growing number of people who could no longer hide from their own actions. Some called it a plague. Others called it an awakening. Both were right. The hammer had fallen. The conscience of humanity had been infected, and nothing would ever be the same. In hospitals and therapy offices and quiet rooms across England, people sat with their guilt, learned to carry it, grew stronger from the weight, became, slowly and painfully, more honestly themselves. Malleus didn't make people good. It made them aware. And awareness, it turned out, was the first step toward actual morality. Not the comfortable morality of following rules and feeling righteous, but the hard morality of knowing your capacity for harm and choosing, consciously and deliberately, to minimize it. Dr. Tanaka published her findings. Other researchers replicated her methods. Within 5 years, Malleus therapy became a recognized treatment for certain types of moral injury and pathological guilt. Not because it cured the infection, but because it taught people to live with it. The infected never fully recovered. The sharp clarity of their failures never faded. But they learned to function, to build lives, to make better choices now while carrying the weight of worse choices past. They became living proof that guilt, properly integrated, could be transformative rather than destructive. That knowing yourself completely, even the worst parts, was survivable. That you could be simultaneously aware of your moral failures and still worthy of existence. The British government eventually lifted the quarantine around Rothwell. The village returned to something resembling normal life, though everyone there carried Malleus now. Visitors noticed something different about the place. People were more careful with each other, more consciously kind, less likely to commit casual cruelties because they knew, with perfect clarity, what those cruelties cost. Some researchers began to wonder if the 7 monks had actually failed. Maybe Malleus was exactly what they'd intended to create. Not a weapon of punishment, but a tool of genuine moral development. A thing that would force humans to confront their own capacity for harm and make conscious choices about it. If so, the monks had paid a terrible price for that creation. They'd destroyed their own consciences, made themselves into monsters, in order to create something that would preserve conscience in others. The irony was almost beautiful in its cruelty. Or perhaps the monks had simply been fools who thought they could weaponize morality without becoming immoral themselves, who believed they could judge others while remaining unjudged, who sacrificed their humanity in pursuit of a righteousness that couldn't exist in human form. The truth was, probably both. Humans are good at holding contradictions. 5 years after the box was opened, Dr. Mitchell returned to Rothwell. Not for research, but for closure. She stood at the edge of the excavation pit, now filled in and overgrown with grass. The execution ground where Malleus had been buried for 7 centuries looked peaceful. Just another English field, green and quiet and empty. But she could feel it, the presence, not just in herself, but in the land, in the air, in the collective consciousness of everyone who'd been touched by it. Malleus had been imprisoned here, but it had also been born here. This was holy ground, in a twisted way. The birthplace of an entity that had changed the world. "Do you regret opening the box?" Emma Rodriguez asked. She'd come with Dr. Mitchell, the only other team member who'd survived with her sanity relatively intact. They'd stayed in touch, bonded by their shared infection, their mutual understanding of what it meant to carry Malleus. Dr. Mitchell considered the question carefully. She'd learned not to give easy answers anymore. Malleus had taught her that truth was complicated. "I regret the suffering it caused," she said finally. "James never recovered. Dr. Cross is institutionalized. Tom Harrigan committed suicide 18 months ago. I regret all of that deeply. But I can't say I wish we'd never opened it. Because now I know. I know exactly what I did to my mother, to my colleagues, to dozens of people over my lifetime. I can't unknow that. I can't go back to comfortable ignorance. And despite how painful it is, I think I'm better now. More careful, more aware, more honestly trying to minimize harm." Emma nodded slowly. I think about Sophie Chen every day. The girl I didn't defend when we were 12. I found her, last year. Finally got up the courage to reach out properly, not just a Facebook message. Met her for coffee. How did it go? Awkward, painful. She didn't really remember me, which somehow made it worse. I was carrying this guilt for 25 years, and it was just another day in her life. One bad day among thousands. She'd moved past it, built a good life, didn't need or want my apology. Did that make you feel better? No. Because Malleus showed me the truth. It didn't matter whether Sophie remembered or needed my apology. What mattered was that I'd made a choice that hurt another person, and I had to live with that choice. Her forgiveness or lack of memory doesn't erase what I did. It just means she's healthier than I am. They stood in silence for a while, two women carrying invisible parasites, learning to live with the weight of their own imperfection. There are rumors, Emma said eventually, that other boxes exist, that the monks created more than one, or that Malleus wasn't the only entity they summoned before they lost control. Dr. Mitchell had heard the same rumors, had read the fragmentary medieval texts, the hints and allegations. 7 monks, 7 rituals, 7 entities, each created from a different aspect of conscience destroyed. Malleus was conscience as judgment. What were the others? Conscience as shame, as remorse, as self-hatred, as moral paralysis. If there are others, Dr. Mitchell said, someone will find them eventually. Archaeologists keep digging. The past keeps surfacing. And every time we unearth something, we risk releasing it. Should we warn people? Tell them what to look for, how to avoid opening things that should stay sealed? Would it matter? We knew the box was dangerous. The inscriptions, the wards, the way it felt wrong. We knew, and we opened it anyway. Because we were curious. Because we wanted credit for the discovery. Because we were human. Emma smiled sadly. Malleus would say that was our moral failure. The choice to prioritize our curiosity over safety. Malleus would be right. They left the field as the sun began to set. 2 carriers of an ancient parasite, walking back into a world that was slowly being infected by the truth. Behind them, the grass grew over the filled excavation pit, hiding the place where humanity's conscience had been imprisoned and freed. In Cambridge, in the secure facility, the black box sat in its climate-controlled vault. The inscriptions still moved, still whispered, still promised judgment. Sometimes researchers would check on it, make sure the seals were intact, verify that nothing had escaped. But they all knew the verification was pointless. The most dangerous thing had already escaped. Malleus walked free now, spreading through human consciousness, one infected person at a time, forcing honesty, demanding accountability, stripping away comfortable lies. Some people called for the box to be destroyed, melted down, dissolved in acid, obliterated so completely that no trace remained. But the experts warned against it. The box wasn't just a container. It was a ward, a seal, a reminder. Destroying it might release whatever remained inside, might break whatever binding still held. Better to let it sit. To remember, to acknowledge that humans had created this thing, had tried to weaponize morality, and had paid a terrible price. The box was a monument now, a gravestone, a warning. And in hospitals, therapy offices, and quiet rooms around the world, people learned to live with Malleus, learned to carry their guilt without being crushed, learned to look in the mirror of their own conscience and survive what they saw there. Not all of them succeeded. The suicide rate among the infected remained high. The psychological toll was immense. Some people simply couldn't bear the weight of knowing themselves completely. But those who survived emerged different. More careful, more aware, more genuinely trying to live ethically, not because they believed they were good people, but because they knew exactly how easy it was to be bad. They formed support groups, online communities, networks of people who'd been infected and learned to integrate the parasite into their psyches. They shared strategies for coping with the visions, the memories, the endless moral inventory that Malleus demanded. They became, in a strange way, more compassionate. Because when you truly know your own capacity for harm, for cruelty, for convenient cowardice, you can't judge others quite as harshly. You see their failures and recognize your own. You see their struggles and understand viscerally how hard it is to be good. 10 years after the box was opened, a young graduate student named Amira Hassan began researching the long-term effects of Malleus infection. She interviewed hundreds of carriers, documented their experiences, tracked their outcomes. What she found surprised her. The infected had higher rates of charitable giving, lower rates of interpersonal violence, were more likely to intervene in moral emergencies, more likely to report ethical violations, more likely to make personal sacrifices for collective good. They weren't better people exactly. They still failed, still made mistakes, still hurt others sometimes. But they did it less often, and when they did, they couldn't hide from it, couldn't pretend it didn't matter, couldn't rationalize it away. It's like Malleus created a population of people who can't lie to themselves, Amira wrote in her dissertation. They're forced to be honest about their moral status. And that honesty, painful as it is, makes them more careful, more consciously ethical. Not because they're good, but because they know exactly how easy it is to be bad. Her research was controversial. Some people argued she was romanticizing a parasitic infection, making it sound beneficial when it had destroyed thousands of lives. Others argued she was onto something important, that perhaps humanity needed Malleus, needed something to force honesty about our moral failures. The debates raged in academic journals, philosophy conferences, ethics committees. Everyone had an opinion. No one had a solution. Because the truth was, Malleus couldn't be controlled or contained or eliminated. It was part of human consciousness now, a permanent addition to the psychological landscape. Something humans would have to learn to live with, individually and collectively. Dr. Mitchell, now 73 years old, gave a lecture at Cambridge on the 20th anniversary of the box's opening. She stood in front of a packed auditorium, decades of carrying Malleus visible in the lines of her face, the weight in her posture, the careful precision of her words. "We opened something that should have stayed closed," she began. "We unleashed a parasite that has infected millions and will continue spreading. We caused immeasurable suffering. Those are facts, and I take full responsibility for them." She paused, looking out at the audience. Students, researchers, survivors of the infection, curious observers, all of them waiting to hear what wisdom she'd gained from 2 decades of carrying guilt. "But I've also learned something important," she continued. "Guilt is information. It's your conscience telling you that your actions didn't match your values, that you caused harm you didn't intend, or harm you did intend but shouldn't have. That's valuable information. Most people ignore it, rationalize it away, bury it under psychological defenses. Malleus doesn't let you do that. It forces you to look, to know, to carry the weight of what you've done. And yes, that's painful. Yes, some people can't survive it. But those who do, we change. We become more consciously ethical, not because we're good people, but because we can't hide from being bad." Someone in the audience raised their hand. "Do you think humanity is better off with Malleus?" Dr. Mitchell considered carefully. 20 years of consideration had taught her to weigh her words, to acknowledge complexity, to resist easy answers. "I think humanity is more honest with Malleus," she said finally. "Whether that's better, I can't say. Honesty is painful, but it's also necessary for genuine morality. You can't make good choices if you're lying to yourself about your capacity for bad ones." "Would you close the box if you could go back?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I think about it every day. I dream about it at night. That moment when James touched the symbol and the box opened. Could I have stopped him? Should I have? Would that have been the moral choice?" Malleus shows me that moment constantly. Shows me every second, every decision, every possibility. And the truth is, I don't know what I should have done. I only know what I did do. And I have to live with that. Forever. The lecture ended. The audience dispersed. Dr. Mitchell stood alone on the stage, feeling the familiar weight of Malleus in her consciousness, the ever-present awareness of every failure, every flaw, every moment she'd chosen wrong. But she was still standing, still functioning, still trying, consciously and deliberately, to make better choices now. That was all anyone could do, all anyone infected by truth could ever do. The parasite of conscience fed on guilt, but it also preserved it. Made it impossible to forget, impossible to rationalize, impossible to escape. And in that impossibility lay a strange kind of grace. Because when you couldn't hide from your failures, you had to face them, had to acknowledge them, had to carry them. And in carrying them, you became stronger, more honest, more genuinely moral, not perfect, never perfect, but aware, conscious, trying. And perhaps in the end, that was enough. The box remained sealed in Cambridge. The infected continued to spread. The parasite of conscience continued to grow, feeding on humanity's endless capacity for guilt, forcing honesty, demanding accountability. Some people still called it a plague, others called it an evolution. Both were right. Malleus was the hammer that broke comfortable lies, the parasite that fed on denial, the mirror that showed the truth, and it was still hungry, still growing, still waiting in the conscience of everyone it touched. The question wasn't whether it would find you. Given enough time, enough honesty, enough willingness to look at yourself clearly, it would. The question was what you'd do when it did. Would you break, or would you integrate? Would you deny, or would you accept? Would you hide, or would you see? The hammer was coming. The parasite was spreading. The mirror was waiting. And in the end, everyone would have to look. Everyone would have to see themselves as they actually were, stripped of pretense and self-deception and comfortable lies. And then everyone would have to decide, can I live with this truth? Can I carry this weight? Can I be human, flawed and failing and trying anyway? Some would say yes, some would say no, but everyone would have to answer. The hammer had fallen. The conscience of humanity had been infected, and nothing would ever be the same.